Hello, flat earth researchers, debaters, and debunkers. We see as we go on this journey of self discovery and truth seeking and finding out that a lot of what we believed as knowledge was not, in fact, the case. And then we are gradually unraveling the layers of what we identify with, and we learn how to identify those things that we identify with, and those how those things ultimately cause us suffering. So identity is a mental concept that causes suffering. It's that idea or the thought or the belief of the who or what am I. And when we talk about I, we're talking about this person that you kind of relate to as your name in this body, and you have a certain way of thinking that you'll find throughout the course of your life that might be the same as some others, but often diversifies from many of the other people you come into contact with. That's life. So we have to realize at some point that everyone is an individual, and they'll have thought processes going on that are very much dependent on that person's experience and, of course, their personality and just their way of thinking about things or their way of seeing things. And of course, if we strongly identify with the way we are, the way we see ourselves compared to other people, then we will experience suffering. There's a whole list of stuff we could be suffering from, right? With this idea of identifying with things that are not the real you. They are just this thing that we learn or naturally develop after a few years. For example, when we're a baby, we might experience pain and comfort and good or bad sensations. And so, of course, we'll react to them. But then maybe a few months or years later, when we've developed a better understanding of the world around us and finding a place in the world, then we might start identifying with things, especially things around us. And then we form attachments to them. And so we identify with certain things. They give us comfort. And then we start to develop a life story about who I am. But this is all conceptual. It's all going on in the mind, right? Teenagers go through lots of different phases. They change as they explore from one trend to another, the way they dress, the way they talk, the things they read or watch or talk about, usually evolve over time, right? And so attachment kind of wanes to certain things. But at our core, we'll usually form some kind of self-identity. And that will drive us maybe to do things or act in certain ways, right? So we might identify with money. Monetary wealth. It's an obvious one, right? And we can see that that's something that happens all over the world, from people's houses to cars and the fashion they wear. So, of course, bundled up in all of that is a whole bunch of things that you're supposed to identify with: scents, colors, styles, brand names, right? And so a lot of that can also denote your status or class. This is something you might identify with, right? You might be proud of saying you're upper class or even lower class or somewhere in the middle. Possessions, of course, material things, we can become very attached to them, right? Knowledge is something that we can become attached to. Of course, if you study a particular area or subject or topic, and that's the amazing thing, isn't it? Because every single one of us will have distinctly different insights because of the knowledge we've actually gained from experience, and it might be from what we've read as well. But again, this can become an attachment. We can build our own little pedestal of the knowledge we've accumulated, and then we might stand upon it and start demanding that everyone look up to me on my pedestal of knowledge. Look at all the books I'm standing on, all the great thinkers I'm following on from. You might identify with a sports team, really common. You know, again, these are just real life examples that are very, very obvious, and we know that someone will get very, very emotionally involved in a football match, for example. It's a roller coaster ride. Watching a match unfold, losing is horrible because there's so much identification going on with that team, those colours, or whatever it is, the hometown. Maybe it's a healthy outlet. Childhood memories are a good one to think about. Like, as we grow older, we might want to cling on to childhood memories of when times were good, when times were carefree. People were looking after us. We didn't have a worry in the world. And it's a brief moment in most of our lives, because we are soon brought into line to toe the line with the system and the culture and just the way things are, that we think or assume have kind of naturally evolved to the way they are. Education systems, government systems, commerce. Bad memories of childhood might also be something you identify with. And then we get into the whole kind of victim status thing. And of course, people undergo enormous suffering when they're young because, well, we feel so terrible about someone experiencing something bad at the hands of someone else when they are young because they are so defenseless. Of course, we know that as someone grows up, they can make decisions about, you know, who they want to interact with, or whether they're going to hang around with someone that's obviously dangerous or not good for them. And that kind of goes off on a on a tangent of free will. We might ponder the question of, do we have free will? Is it all preordained? Is our life going to work out one way or the other, regardless of what we do? I think personally that when you get to this point of understanding how we identify with things and concepts, and see that happening in ourselves, and then we are able to rectify it and let go of these feelings of identifying with the material world or even the conceptual world. When we are free of that, it's quite a profound change, because then you're no longer trying to control the situation in order to uphold your status or your identity or your assumed superiority. Now, I'm talking in general for everybody, including myself. When I say you, it's just a generic term. But this is said with the knowledge that from someone that's been through all of these experiences anyway, just like any other human being with these natural tendencies, these built-in tendencies to, at some point in our early years, begin identifying with things and seeking comfort from them and wanting to keep them, and we identify as ours, belonging to me. So when it comes to free will, a lot of the time, of course, we make decisions, and they may often be on instinct, and we may be quite unconscious of some of those things that we do to negotiate and navigate our way around life. But then sometimes situations arise where our immediate reaction is for the ego, as it were, to jump to its own defense if the identity of the I is threatened. Then there's an immediate reaction. Now, for the most part, when we're being very unconscious about the way we conduct ourselves, the thoughts and the words come out almost simultaneously, and with an emotion attached to an emotion. So an emotion explodes in our chest, for example. It might be anger. We think it and we blurt it out. All happens boom, almost in synchronicity. But it's not until we start creating space between the emotion, the thought, and whatever is then said or verbalized or even written down as a reaction or a response to what's happened. And you can see as an observer a lot of the time how people descend into arguments because one side misunderstood the other and the other side attacked the other or something. You see people cascade into the depths of an argument before you can even do something to stop them and say, hey, you when you're an observer. But the trick is to observe ourselves, right? To observe what's happening in our own minds and how our identification with any particular thing, be it materialist, something material or something conceptual, causes suffering. And so when we start to recognize the emotions, the reactions, based on the things we identify with, the things we are attached to, when we are on the alert for spotting these things when they arise, we can then change, as I said, put gaps between the three things happening there: the emotion that arises, noticing the emotion, and then the thought that arises with that emotion. What's the story that comes with that emotion? And then how is that verbalized? You can watch these three things happen within. And of course, if we just put a little bit of space, or a breather, as it were, between those three events, then we slow down the process, we become a little bit more analytical about it, we observe it rather than being unconsciously carried along with the wave of emotion and then descending into some kind of fight with someone because we just blurted out whatever was on our mind, or whatever our mind, how it reacted to what was said or done to us. And so it's these kinds of reactions that we see all the time, from when you're simply asking people to use their own discernment between knowledge and belief. And if one can arrive at a place mentally where they can say, well, I believe this to be true, but I don't know it to be true. That's quite a leap. It's quite a grown-up thing to admit. It takes some courage, especially if you are identified with a particular thing. So, of course, when people identify with things like their qualifications, their occupation, their own achievements, or the collective achievements of humanity, we could talk about technological developments, even space exploration, then anything that threatens that will, of course, be met with some kind of defense mechanism or an attack. So one of the defense mechanisms we see is ridicule. And that never seems to change. A lot of people don't seem to grow out of that. In fact, they decided to make a living out of making fun of other people. People that they haven't taken the time to really try and understand, but at the same time are probably still stuck in that identification quagmire, where they don't even realize how strongly they identify with something and the reactions or the behaviors that arise because of that attachment to something that they identify with, such as mankind's developments. And a lot of them, it's funny, isn't it, because these technological developments lead to what? Something somewhere in the future, some hope, some promise of a brighter future. So it would mean to me that there is some dissatisfaction with the present moment, with the now. And there is almost a blind faith in the miracles that technology can bring, and how it can bring about positive change to humankind. And we can get off this rock, we can go to these barren planets and we can populate them. This is really in the realms of fantasy. And it would appear that progress is being made in that direction, yeah? But to what ends? Where does it really take us? because the journey is looking outside and within and being critical and intellectually honest with oneself about what is and what isn't, and what is believed and what is knowledge, and what we identify with in this false idea of who we are supposed to be. Really, we're supposed to be aiming for detachment and becoming an observer, because as we go through life, we learn about the suffering. We go through suffering in trying to cling on to these things that we identify with. And the only way to end the suffering is to let go. And so, again, back to the whole free will thing, when we let go, that's a free will. That allows the universe to take you where you are supposed to be. Because when you have free will, you can choose not to make a decision based on certain demands by people that identify with the things that you no longer identify with, and you have abandoned and are not affected by, and do not feel are any consequence to your life. These conceptual trophies of prowess, such as subscriber counts on social media. So when we encounter a scene like this in nature, we have a tranquil lake in front of us, reflecting the snow-capped mountains in the distance, and we have this layer of cloud during sunset, creating this very dramatic scene that has a warm glow to it. Our immediate reaction is just to be struck by the beauty that nature has painted for us to enjoy. And we might not go any further than that. But on another level, depending on how strongly we identify with certain concepts about who we are and where we are, all of us can look at the same scene and see the same thing, but each might have a different interpretation of the how and why this scene is happening based on the concept they have come to believe in. Of course, if we hold on to this concept, or we identify with this concept of being on a spinning spherical earth, we believe that sunrises and sunsets, or all the movements in the sky, are not because the sky is moving or things are moving in the sky, but because the earth is spinning on an axis. And again, for the most part, that really doesn't come into the conversation or the thought process or the just the admiration of a scene like this. We just enjoy it for what it is. We just enjoy the moment, right? But if the mechanics of it, the how and why, are brought into question, then if someone strongly identifies with the globe earth belief, then they will try to rely on, or even make up explanations to explain how what we see in front of us fits with the globe earth model or concept. So of course the strength of that attachment, or the identification with this idea that we're on a globe in a heliocentric system, will very much depend on well, a variety of things really, but it could depend on if someone has a career that involves navigation, then the globe will be a very, very solid and will feel like an almost tangible concept in the mind, because there is this complete knowledge of how the model works and how you can get around in the real world based on this model. So there might not even seem an apparent reason to question it because it works. But that kind of attachment will prevent someone from seeing the way things really are in a scene like this. Now, this particular photograph doesn't give us too much indication, but I'm going to go through a few more of sunsets so we can talk about what's actually happening in our view. But just before we leave this photograph, we can of course see how perspective gives the scene in front of us depth and an idea of where we are in relation to everything else around us. We can see that we're quite close to the lake's surface. We have a pier or a jetty that's extending out to the right, and we have the clouds going off into the distance. What you can see in this photograph is a lot of what would be parallel lines becoming these diagonals which head off to an apparent point in the distance, giving us this depth to our view. And we understand that the jetty is minuscule compared to the mountains in the distance, but they don't seem to be that much bigger than the jetty. This is, of course, just simply due to our perspective of this particular scene. And we have the clouds going off into the distance, and they eventually appear to disappear behind the mountains at a very, relatively short distance that we can see. If you just look at those mountains there, you can see that the clouds we know are above them have gone further off into the distance. Those ones that are further away, the clouds that are further away than the mountains, now appear to have descended behind the mountains, and they are blocked off. And those mountains, no matter how large or small they appear to us, will always be their true physical size, and they are several kilometers high because they have snow on top of them, for one thing. So that's just one example of how the landscape will obscure our view of the sky at a greater distance and everything else in the sky. So the sun, for example, is higher than the clouds, and it too goes off into the distance. Let's take a look at the next photograph. What can we actually see happening in this photograph? We can't actually see the sun. It's gone beyond the horizon, which seems to be created by land and clouds. But what we can see here is almost like the edge of this sphere of light from the sun. So you could do some calculations and you could work out where the sun is at its zenith, the ground point for the sun, off to in the distance, over in the west there, wherever that would be. And you can see here that we can see the limit of the sun's influence, sphere of influence, as it were. It's spreading its light that far, that's it. So as it travels away from us, we will be left in darkness. And all those mountains and everything that's on the surface will play a role in creating shadow and putting us into shadow. And we won't see the sun, and we won't see sunlight. this is a really dramatic one again, where we can see these crepuscular rays. It doesn't matter whether you assume these to be parallel lines. We still have this point of perspective in the distance, with a sun that appears to be much, much lower than the clouds in front of us, or above us and in the foreground. But the sun isn't really lower than the clouds. It's above them. And that's why the bottoms of those clouds are grey, because they're not, if we took this image to be one that doesn't have any perspective in it, and we were to say that the sun is setting because the earth is rolling around on its axis as a sphere, then the sun should be lighting up the bottoms of these clouds. It should be poking through between that horizon and the clouds. We don't see that happen. This is another example of the undersides of the clouds appearing higher than the sun as it sets, but they are, of course, not lit up by the sun. We also have that lovely reflection on the water, another clue that the water is flat, because that's how reflections work. Reflections are also very bizarre things as well, because they are entirely subjective. Now, you could move along this, let's say it's a beach, as we look across this water, and that reflection on the water of the sun will follow you. It will always be there for you and only you, and someone somewhere else, half a mile away or a mile away or 10 miles away, will see the same thing. They will see a sunset where they have their own subjective reflection. So reflections are only there when you are there to see them. And that's the enigmatic nature of light. We'll also see here that the sun is getting cut off by, I think, clouds and possibly land. And again, we see the edge of this glow of the sun, and higher up in the image, it gets darker. So we do seem to be looking at what is a local sun, a small sun above the clearly level earth. And its sphere of light is limited. Again, just an example of perspective. We have a level surface, and we can almost see this parallel line, or parallel lines of the surface and the sky as they head off into the distance. And then we have the sun again beneath the clouds, but not lighting up the undersides of the clouds. This is another scene that illustrates how perspective works in our eyes. In many ways, we can see the road and the lines on the road that are parallel lines, and they appear to converge in the distance. And we have those trees which are lining the straight road, which also appear to go down towards the horizon, and they appear to converge towards the center of this image. And so understand that exactly the same thing is happening when we see the surface and the sky as a kind of sandwich, and the sun above that, above the clouds going off into the distance. This one is clearly taken at a very, very low level, very close to the water. And so, of course, the waves immediately in front of us become the horizon. We can't see anything beyond that because their angular size is massive in our very low view here. And even if there is land or mountains that are several kilometers high in the distance, these small waves in front of us will block them all off. This is something that's scalable. So here we have a really high vantage point. And so we can see a lot further into the distance. And if you look, you can see mountains and hills in the distance. We're obviously on a hilltop, but there are more in the distance. And we can see that there's cloud cover that actually appears a little bit higher than those hills in the distance. And we can see there that that's what's cutting off the sun as it sets. So we still have whatever is below us and above us contributing to the sun being blocked off. And again, we can see in front of us how the high land has created a shadow across the low land. Not because of as a result of us being on a spinning globe, but simply because the sun has gone far enough away to create these long shadows across the earth. This one is a very plain view. There don't seem to be many clouds in the distance, but what we do see is those clouds eventually do appear to meet the horizon. And so, just like the mountains always maintaining their massive size, no matter how small they appear to be in our vision, then off in the distance there, you inevitably have a layer of clouds or land as well that is part of the horizon, and it's just a razor thin line on the horizon, or it's not even seen as a line, it's just a blur, because it's all just way beyond anything we can make out because of the limit of our vision and that of the conditions as well, the clarity. There's just no need for us to be able to see any further than that. Any imminent danger would be seen for many miles before it arrived. Another excellent illustration of perspective, how the road appears to go off and converge in the distance. We know it's parallel lines. Everything, those white lines in the middle eventually become blurred. But then we don't really have a horizon because we have this structure in front of us. Now you may look at that and wonder what that might have been, how it was created. Is that the remnants of an ancient giant tree. Another example of how we can be high up, but of course the terrain in front of us will also have structures on it. And so again, we can see from this that it's the mountains in front of us that create the sunset. Due to perspective, the sun just gets further away, and inevitably it will be blocked off by the mountain ranges in front of us. And we can see that again, once the sun has gone past those mountain ranges, then it will begin to create shadow, and the further it gets away, the longer that shadow will be. And so if you're at the foot of one of these mountains or hills, you would already be in darkness. The sun would have set for you and you would be in shadow. Another dramatic view that shows the sun to really be like a local light just behind those clouds. And again, a wonderful illustration of perspective, how those clouds are just kissing the surface. But for example, right there in the middle, we know that there might be a mile or two of distance between the surface and the clouds. I think it's raining. There seems to be a storm going on. There's rain coming down. So there would be quite a significant gap. But of course, we see this gap in the distance to appear much, much smaller. And we can't really measure that. We can judge what it might be. As I said, it might be a mile, it might be a couple of miles, because we know that that's how high above the surface of the earth clouds might be. But there's almost no practical way to measure pixels on the screen, for example, and then translate those into a proper measurable height. But again, we see the effects of the clouds blocking off the sun and really creating this shadow, creating darkness for us. So once the sun gets a little bit further away, its light will no longer be seen. So when we see a scene like this, are we envisaging being on a globe, or are we with a massive sun, or can you see it as it appears to be with a local sun above a level earth? Can you accept what you see rather than subconsciously or even consciously interpreting what you see to fit your identification with a globe earth concept? Because nothing in nature would have us assume that or believe that. This one again just shows how land in the distance will cut off the sun for us. We can also see that in this case the horizon is a good indicator of our eye level. You can see where we are in relationship to the grasses in front of us. And we see the edge of that glow receding. It's a lovely scene. But would it indicate that we are on a spinning globe? These northern lights are fascinating. I mean, scientists seem to have some ideas about what they are, and they come from the sun. But they travel incredibly fast, and they go across vast distances, as we can see here. They don't seem to curve, though. Again, we're looking at something that's more like a layer of, like a sandwich of a surface and a sky, in which things travel across the sky. So you never see these northern lights appearing to follow any kind of curvature, which should be more evident given the height and the distance that we can see them for. This one is a winter scene, obviously, and so there we have a very small sun. So just looking at this scene would tell us that it's cold because the sun is very far away. Now, if you believe or identify with this idea that we live on a globe, then you'll say, well, it's the tilt as we spin around and orbit the sun. But we can also interpret it as the sun moving in concentric circles, possibly above a level Earth. And so places that experience a winter time do so when the sun is further away, logically. That's how the scene presents itself to us. But again, it will be filtered by beliefs and how strongly we identify with those beliefs. Another one showing perspective in various forms. The road goes off into the distance. A few street lamps, a few telegraph cables maybe going off into the distance. Again, parallel lines appearing to converge, just as we see the sky as a parallel surface and the earth as a parallel surface appearing to converge in the distance. And this one's a really good example of clouds, or it could possibly be land. I honestly can't tell, but the sun is being blocked off by something either on or very close to the surface, simply because it's further away, while it remains higher still than this band of thick grey clouds at the top, which are of course much, much closer to us. But they are not lit by this sun that you would assume should be lighting up the undersides of the clouds if you don't think perspective is a thing you should be thinking about. Another really good shot, the sun below the clouds, or appearing to be below the clouds, but actually it's still higher than the clouds. Its glow of light is still kind of there, but we can see the moon and the stars emerging too as the sunlight goes away and recedes, leaving darkness. And so other objects with less light become apparent. And this appears to be quite a high altitude view above the clouds and the sun going off into the distance, but we know that eventually the clouds and the bits poking out on the surface and just generally the haziness of the air will eventually create a sunset for us. And you can see here, of course, that the sun is still above the clouds in that respect. It's lighting up those clouds there, but in the foreground, the clouds in front of us are in shadow because they're because the sun has gotten further away and it's casting a shadow from these bits of cloud poking out, just like hills and mountains will on the surface of the earth. The same thing is going on. As above, so below, as it were. And here again we have that reflection that's only ever there for you when you're observing it across a level surface. And we'll just finish off with this one to see this effect again of, you can see the tops of those mountains over there have the last remnants of sun on them as the sun goes away. And then we have a shadow. We are in shadow, and that shadow extends across the lake. So there are probably mountains behind the photographer here that the sun has gone beyond and has now cast a shadow. This is something you can do yourself, practice with a lamp on surfaces, and just see for yourself that that's what happens across a level surface. And you have shadow that won't ever really go higher than the object that's casting the shadow. So you can actually see the outlines of these other mountains in a way as shadow cast on these. But eventually that shadow will become less clearly defined and the light will just fade away from the whole scene. The way the mountains are reflected as well in the water is quite esoteric. Again, it depends on our particular view. Those reflections only appear to us. They are not always reflected in the water. If we had a different perspective, we might only see the clouds above the water reflected in the water. But the entire scene that we see, those distant mountains that are way beyond the water, are actually reflected in the water. And so this scene is only happens when we are there to see it. It is created in the eye of the beholder, as it were. And so when we can detach from the identity we have with a certain concept about the way things are, we can then just go back to appreciating it for what it is. Without prejudice. And without feeling that your point of view has to be impressed upon someone else, or you have to convince someone else to think or see it the same way. It's there for us to see. But this whole journey, a truth-seeking journey, it begins with noticing these things that we identify with, recognizing how forming attachments to identities, you could even call it these false idols, if you like. It doesn't have to be a religious figure, but a false idol can be anything that we conceive or perceive, as being something that represents us, something external or some kind of concept that we identify with. So forming some kind of identity or an attachment to an identity is a form of worshipping a false idol. You idolize something, and that gives you. This again goes to back to the suffering, because then you might well have desires to inflict some kind of pain on those who don't see it the same way as you. You may feel or that you're a victim. So you start blaming others or complaining about others, bringing these things to your attention, and that would make you feel stronger or more superior. And so, but these are all aspects of this problem we have with identifying and having a life story that we identify with. It blinds us from seeing the way things really are. Thank you very much.